Hey everybody, I'm wandering around Dulles Airport like a zombie because I had to get up at 4 o'clock this morning to get to the airport. That happens far too often in my life. It got me thinking about nutraceuticals. You familiar with that term? It's basically just a food additive that has medicinal benefits. You probably take some if you take omega-3 or turmeric. And the new one that the wellness company, our sponsor, has come out with is a product called Recharge. And that combines methylene blue, which is a food additive that once was used to treat malaria. And now it's being used by researchers and biohackers to boost their mitochondrial function and increase their immune system and lift that brain fog, which I could really use right now. So people like RFK Jr. are using it to boost their personal health, and you ought to check it out. You can go to twc.health/hotzone and use code HOTZONE and get 10% off and support our sponsor. So you ought to do that. That's twc.health/hotzone and use code HOTZONE. So I've got a special guest for you today that you're going to really enjoy. Nate Vance is a former U.S. Marine who has spent some significant amount of time in Ukraine fighting on the Ukrainian side against Russian aggression. So we're going to talk to him about how he feels about that. Give us a little bit of your history. When were you in the Marine Corps? What'd you do in the Marine Corps, and what'd you do after you got out?
Man, well, I joined in '97 because I'm old, you know what I mean, and then did 4 years. I was a pretty bog standard infantryman. I was a machine gunner the whole time. You know, I know the Marines do it a little bit different, where that's a specific MOS. But that's what I did. You know what I mean? I'm not, you know, Delta Dan. I'm not, you know what I mean? I'm not one of the, you know, 99 Zulus or whatever they call them in the Army.
Hey,
you know
I've spent
I mean?
a lot of time with the Marines in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'll tell you, if I mean, having been an Army Ranger, I feel like if I can keep up with those guys for a week, I'm going to feel pretty good about myself because they're pretty hardcore.
I mean, yeah, they're not concerned about whether or not you're tired, for sure. You know what I mean?
Or
That's never
right.
No. That's the bottom of the list.
I used to joke that in Afghanistan, like when the Marines show up someplace, if the Air Force shows up in a new location, the first thing they do is go, okay, where do we put the NCO club or the officers club? Where do we put the swimming pool? You know, and when the Marines show up, they just go, okay, we need a gym. Let's put it in the hot sun with no shade, built out of sandbags, and that's about good for us.
Yeah, we used to joke
it's amazing
that the Marine
how
Corps...
they can just be so, I don't know, traditionally well known for enduring hardship. But so what did you learn from your time in the Marine Corps, and how has that helped you in the rest of your life?
Well, I ended up working in oil and gas. Spent some time in West Virginia, as a matter of fact, Wetzel County, which is back there in the woods. You know what I mean? But that's another industry where if you're not comfortable being uncomfortable, you probably won't last very long. You're gonna be working outside. You know, they don't care if the weather's bad. They don't care if you're cold. They don't care if they don't care what's going on. You're gonna work, and if you don't like it, you can. You know, there's the door. You can go get another job somewhere else. I mean, that's pretty much it. So it did help me in that sense. That when I got to the oil field, a lot of the new guys were like, "Man, this is really hard," and I was like, "They give us lunch." You know, I mean, this is crazy. This is a good day. This is a good day.
I don't have to get up until 6 o'clock.
Well, that's not true. Yeah, you get up about 3:30 in the morning. But, but yeah, I mean, it's just it's that thing where you're kind of spending every waking moment of your life with a bunch of dudes, you know what I mean, doing hard work and going home and then living with them again. And I think for a lot of civilians, that's like, a lot of invasion of privacy and things like that. And there's not a lot of civilians willing to do that. You see a lot of military people end up going into the oil and gas industry because they're like, oh, this is just,
more of the
same thing, another task, you know what I mean? Right. So,
yeah. So then when the war started in Ukraine, what possessed you to want to go over there and actually fight?
Well, initially I didn't want to fight. I mean, I was, my thought process was like, I'm probably a little too old for this nonsense.
Guy can get hurt doing that.
Well, yeah, you know, it hurts getting out of bed sometimes when you get to a certain age. But
Right.
but I did have a sense that I was like, okay, look, there's several factors, and I don't think anybody makes a decision like that just based on one thing. It's always like a series of decisions. I don't know which one was the biggest one in my thought process. I want to say that it was just to help, right? Or go and see if I could help. And that's the difficult part because I don't know anything about Ukraine. I don't know anything about their infrastructure or what's going on. But you watch the news. I don't have a lot of faith in the media in general. So what I'm seeing, I'm like, how much of this can I believe or how much of this is accurate and things like that. So I want to see it. So curiosity is part of it. And, you know, yeah, so I wanted to see what was actually going on. And if there was a way that I could help in some way, then I would be willing to help. And if I got over there and realized that I'm just in the way, then I need to leave.
Mm-hmm. So what was the moment that you knew this was not just another foreign conflict? You know, something you said, I got to be a part of this.
Well, I knew right away, right? There was even before the invasion happened, maybe a couple of weeks before. You know, initially I thought, this is saber rattling. You know, Putin's just, you know, scaring Ukraine into, you know, scaring them away from NATO. He's done that a few times in the past, and I thought that was kind of more of the same. And then I remember hearing that they were sending a lot of whole blood products over to Belarus. Somebody got that report out, and I was like, well, you don't do that unless you expect somebody to spring a leak. So it's coming.
How did you make the transition from I'm just going to help in Ukraine to see what I can do to I want to pick up a gun and actually go fight?
Well, you know, in classic American style, I kind of mission crept myself. You know what I mean? I went over there and linked up with some guys where we were just packing up IFACs and sending them to the front. And you know, at that point, the front was Kyiv, right? So we would pack up some of these IFACs and cold weather gear, just random non-lethal military type stuff. And in the process of those deliveries, you link up with units and you meet them and you start to recognize, and they're telling you what their needs are, right? And a lot of those units were just not real military units. They were more like militia groups. And, you know, they got guys who were soccer hooligans last week and now they're fighting the Russian army.
Right.
Which, you know,
desperately needed training for sure.
100%. And, you know, I'm thinking to myself, there was some other groups providing training, and I linked up with them, and we tried to kind of, you know, just steer in that direction. And when I did, I remember talking to this guy who's a former Marine lieutenant. I think it was lieutenant colonel. I don't want to demote the guy if he was a full bird, but I was like, man, you know, it's been 2+ decades since I've done this. You know, I'm not sure I'm qualified, and I've said this on other platforms. It's kind of a testament to the Marine Corps that, you know, like once I got in front of those weapon systems again, right? And there's something to be said about, you know, having some surly NCO that, like when we were talking about, they don't care if you're tired. It's like, I don't care if you're doing it again anyway. You know what I mean? You're going to do it again anyway. And you're like, I'm tired, my feet hurt, my back hurts, all this stuff. You know what I mean? It's like, well, too bad. You know, like USMC stands for you sign the mother contract. You know what I mean? So you're doing it again. And so that, you know, and that type of thing, it's not rocket science, and there's a certain element of muscle memory. So it came back pretty quick, and I was able to just figure it out.
Have you tried to talk to JD Vance about what's going on in Ukraine? Obviously, he's got a very different understanding of what's going on. Why do you think that is?
No, I have talked to him. To him. And I'm not going to go into intimate details of the conversations and stuff like that, but he does have a better understanding than I think the media would portray of what's going on. But there's also a certain amount, and if you've been over there, I'm sure you get it too. You get what I'm about to say. Is Americans tend to have the mistaken sense that everybody in the world wants what we want, and everybody in the world thinks like we think. And it's not true, right? There are cultural differences, and people kind of look at things through a different lens, and they've had different experiences, and they don't negotiate or behave the same way we do. So, and I don't know that there's a way that you can read your way into that. I don't know if you can read enough books or study enough to really get it. You kind of have to be immersed in it, I think, to truly understand it. And I was immersed in it for several years, and there's still elements of those cultural differences that surprise me on a daily basis, right? And that doesn't mean they're right or we're wrong or any other thing. It's just a lot to understand for any person when it comes to those negotiating practices. And when you take a guy like the president or the vice president, who it's their job to understand every culture on Earth, you're going to get it wrong sometimes. I mean, you're gonna make mistakes, and you're gonna have to like learn as you go, and that's just kind of the weird thing about being a politician, and dealing with global politics. So
how do you explain the disconnect between what's actually happening on the front lines in Ukraine and what Americans are being told by some of their leaders?
Well, some of it, man, I don't know. Like, what I honestly believe is, have you ever seen a video of what a bot farm looks like?
Oh, yeah.
And you see that, and then those bot farms are pumping out propaganda nonsense all over the United States all the time, right? The internet's a good thing, but it's also, opens you up and makes you a little vulnerable to that kind of influence. The FSB and the Russians in particular, they know that they can't beat us kinetically, so that's an area that they focused a significant amount of, time and energy and, intellectual bandwidth into. And they pump that out, and then politicians are generally responding to what's popular. So if they post something, and then whether it's a real person or a bot responds to it, and they gauge that as, oh, well, now I got my finger on the pulse of the population. I don't think they really do, because there are Americans that are crazy and think that Putin's a good dude, and Pol Pot was a good guy. I've had people try to explain to me that Hitler was just a misunderstood artist that liked his dog. You know what I mean? And I'm like, you're an idiot. Don't vote, please.
Yeah.
But there are those people out there. But typically, most reasonably thinking Americans, if you just you talk to them and you show them what's actually going on, they go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense, But it's just a matter of, most of those people are working. They have kids. They're busy, right? So getting that information to them and showing them and doing it in a calm manner is it's difficult sometimes, getting the ability to communicate that to them is hard. So I think politicians
I think they kind of play on the fact that Americans are tired of being taken advantage of around the world. And rightly so, but what they're doing is they're interrupting the calculus that you would normally go through to say, yes, but this is something worth doing, either from a moral standpoint or from an economic standpoint or from a global geopolitics standpoint, and they're interrupting that sort of OODA loop, so to speak. You served. From my understanding, in some of the bloodiest places in Ukraine so far in the war, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, places I've been to as well, and it's World War I. It looks like, well, it's incredible out there.
No, it's
what?
Yeah, it's. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, what moment stands out to you the most of your experience there?
People have asked me that before, and they're like, "What was the most dangerous part?" And I'm like, a gunfight's a gunfight. They're all bad, right? And the moment you get into one, and I think there's a certain amount of, we all have a certain amount of bravado, or we wouldn't pick up a gun and go into those things. And that bravado quickly evaporates the moment rounds are coming your way, whether they're artillery or anything else, right? Everybody, and it's this weird cycle where we psychologically, as soon as it's over, we're looking for another one. But as soon as it starts, we're like, how do I end this as quickly as possible? The actual act of that is not fun. It's exhilarating, I guess you could say is a word to describe it, but fun and exhilarating are not the same thing all the time, right? And the one that really stands out to me, honestly, was where I was relatively safe in retrospect, but it was in Vuhledar. And it was me and a Ukrainian guy, and we got tasked with going up to the top of a building with an anti-tank, like an old Soviet anti-tank wire-guided missile. And it was like, well, if you see vehicles, take them out. And in Vuhledar, like for people that don't understand, it's kind of like a bastion on top of a hill surrounded by fields. And the Russians were attacking it. Like there was a scene in the movie Patriot where the British just came out of this field like in the morning one time near the main star's house, and they're just like in formation walking through the fields. And and in the 1770s and 1780s, that was a perfectly viable tactic. In 2023, you're going to die if you do that. And the Russians just didn't seem to get the memo between the 1770s, and they just came across those fields. And I remember thinking and saying to my Ukrainian buddy who spoke English, I was like, man, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. It's just monumentally stupid. It's just a waste, which is kind of an analog for the entire conflict, right? Like it's just a massive waste that probably will be fruitless at the end of the day, and just a massive waste of life.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think Americans would be shocked to learn about the Ukrainian soldiers that you served with, or the Ukrainian civilians for that matter?
I think they'd be shocked to realize how much like them they are. You know what I mean? Like the one thing that I kind of try to communicate to people is I was like, if you're, a family-oriented, fairly conservative American, you would fit right in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's pretty much what they're like. They're kind of like a Norman Rockwell painting. They just speak a different language. And again, some of those little cultural differences, I mean, at the end of the day, they're irrelevant. They're silly, right? These people want to take care of their kids. They want to come home. They want to be left alone. They don't want some foreign government telling them what to do all the time. And they value their freedom enough to fight for it and potentially die for it. So, that's another part of the calculus that went into me deciding to go fight for them. I mean, if I thought they were terrible people, like I'm not gonna risk my life, but they were good dudes, man. They're good dudes, and just.
I
just
imagine
like us,
you
right?
have lost some people that you know over there. How do you, knowing that, how do you respond to people who say, this isn't our fight?
I mean, it's difficult, right? Because as an American, I completely respect people's right to have an opinion. I can't get aggressive about that, even though sometimes I want to. When people say, I don't care about those people, your gut reaction once you know them and are personally connected to them is one where you want to, for lack of a better term, just reach out and punch them in the mouth. But you can't, you know what I mean? They have every right to have that opinion. I think it just boils down to kind of remaining calm, checking your emotions, and trying to explain to them, as long as they're willing to listen, trying to explain to them why it is our fight. In a sense, I don't think we need to put boots on the ground over there. But the reason we have security elements overseas is because we learned after World War II that if we're going to get in a fight, and fights suck, do it over there, right? Keep those conflicts on the other side of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Don't let them come to our shores. Us having bases overseas has very little to do with the security of, this is going to sound bad foreign policy wise, but it doesn't have as much, for our sake, it doesn't have as much to do with the security of the nation where we have that base as much as it does our own security and keeping that conflict over there.
Yeah, I agree.
So, a Russia that's expanding west can apply all sorts of leverage on Western Europe, Africa, with the food deliveries and things like that. And it can just make problems worse for us and more difficult. And that's what I think Putin's goal is anyway, is an attempt to decouple the United States from NATO. Yeah. Which for those Americans who feel like we've been getting taken advantage of, that probably sounds like a good thing. But it also sounds like a good thing to Putin, and Putin does not have our best interests at heart. So what's good for him is probably bad for us.
So what would real U.S. I mean, I think you're completely right on that. I mean, as Russia has been drawn deeper and deeper into Ukraine and has had this staggering losses there, they have been unable to foment shenanigans in other places around the world as they were doing up until 2022 in places like Armenia and Syria and places like, Africa, Mali, different countries. So what would real U.S. leadership look like on the Ukraine topic in your view?
Well, for one thing, Putin is not interested in a ceasefire. He's not going to. And I think any kind of honest attempt, if you're really holding things up in order to, achieve some type of negotiated ceasefire, it's really a waste of time, right? So he is kicking the can down the road. And if you look at the demands he's placing on things, he's now adding other countries to those lists of demands, right? Moldova and Georgia. That's, in my view, intentionally designed to force these negotiations to not work. And by forcing them not to work, it's just, I think they've gotten to the point where they're like, oh, we can string this along. Maybe they'll hold off on doing certain other things like, economic sanctions and stiffer sanctions. I mean, but war is as economic as it is tactical and strategic. And if you can, the United States beat the Soviet Union with its economic power, not with the military. And the Russians are not the Soviets of the 1970s, right? They're not. They're a shell of that. The Russian economy that we know of is smaller than Italy's.
Yeah, they're right next to Benin now. I saw the other day, which is insane.
It's they've atrophied considerably, right? Their infrastructure is kind of failing because they're having to devote all of their money, all of their available funds to the war. The fact that they don't produce many of the things they need means they need to trade in dollars or euros to, purchase those things through third parties and get around sanctions to get the things they need to fight. The United States just has to beat them economically, and they won't be able to continue to fight at some point. And it does work. It's been proven to work. So, we don't need to go over there and shoot them. But then at the same time, if we're going to throw away some weapon system or set it out in the desert to rot, why not give it to the Ukrainians and let them damage our enemies and our adversaries with it? Just doesn't make sense not to do that. So
I agree. Well, you've bucked your own political party and even your family, I guess, on Ukraine. What has the cost of that been to you?
I mean, look, I will say this about when I did sit down with JD is, I was like, look, man, I'm not trying to be adversarial or pick a fight, you know what I mean? But if I I might disagree with you in public. And I also asked him, is there anything in particular any topics I should avoid? I don't want to screw anything up foreign policy wise. Mm-hmm. And his response was, this is America. You're free to have whatever opinions you want. So, that's his view on it. So it really cost me nothing.
Nice. Well, last question. You've got probably more combat experience now than most Americans have. I mean, there are actually very few Americans who have experienced up close and personal combat like you have, even among members of the U.S. military that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, because only about 2% of people who served in those places actually fired a round in anger. So from what you've learned, from your experience as a Marine officer, and then, now through your time in Ukraine, what would you want your fellow Americans to understand, not just about the war in Ukraine, but about just everything: courage, loyalty, and standing up for the truth? What do you want Americans to understand about what you've learned?
Well, like the main thing is, for the United States, I mean, there's never going to be a direct analog between the United States and what's currently going on in Ukraine, mainly because we have a several $1 trillion Air Force, right, which is going to change things dramatically for any future fight. So if you base the future U.S. strategy off 100% of what's going on in Ukraine, some of it's not going to be valuable because we have that, asset available that the Ukrainians don't.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like you take a Pacific War, for example, where, you know, some of the, like the Marine Corps' thought processes, we're going to have, you know, Marines on these little island chains all over the place. Air power can't be everywhere all at once, and those vast different distances mean there's probably going to be times where, you know, if that were to come to fruition, God forbid, you're going to have Marines engaged in combat when there's no air support available. And when that's the case, it's kind of a fair fight, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I have no doubt in the Marines, you know, fortitude and things like that. But when you're preparing for that, you know, that's a hard place to be. It's just difficult, and you got to have kind of an unwavering sense of optimism and confidence in your ability to do what you need to do. Mm-hmm. And just that never give up kind of an attitude. And I think when we're preparing our young men and women for combat operations, I would much rather those men and women be uncomfortable. And I'm not concerned about their comfort, right? Like if it was my loved one or somebody that was getting sent to the front and their NCO was like, hey, they might be uncomfortable, I'm like, I don't care. I want them to be ready. And if that readiness means they got to suffer a little bit, I'd rather them suffer here in peacetime in a controlled environment than go suffer over there at the hands of the enemy where, you know, they get really hurt. And then the other main thing is like, and then the other thing is, you know, Americans are generally fairly peaceful and kind and polite to each other. You know, I know there's a lot of violence, but for the most part, most Americans you meet are pretty friendly. There are evil people in this world. You know, there is evil out there, and there are people that, sorry to say it, need to catch a round. And somebody has to do that. And if nobody does it, those people will do what they want. And it will find its way to your doorstep eventually. So don't think that isolationism is the answer. It isn't.
Boom. That's perfect. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for being with us, Nate. How can people follow you or find you if they want to hear more from you?
Man, I got an X account. I completely kind of got away from social media for a few years for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. And I got an X account. It's at Vance Nate. And that's pretty much the only social media account I'm running right now. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. We certainly appreciate it, and I hope you'll consider me a friend, and I'm happy to help you if I ever can, and maybe have you on again sometime.
Well, yeah, if you need some psycho to go overseas and report on something, I have a very high risk tolerance. So, you know.
It sounds like it. Sounds like it. All right. My kind of guy, that's for sure. Safety third, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. God bless you. Thank you very much for coming on with us.
You too, man. Take care.